we'd be happy to take questions. And then we have some people that would like to follow up.
So I have to be philosophical. There's a tension inherent in our culture between egalitarianism and individualism. And I'm wondering if what we're seeing is a symptom, if what you've described is a symptom of that inherent tension, and that it is our inability or our unwillingness or our purposeful desire not to resolve that tension that leads to situations like the ones you've described, and that as long as that tension exists in our culture, phenomena of this type will continue.
That's a good point. I don't know if this is going to speak to it or not, but my husband and I were talking about this, and I was, kind of telling him what I was going to talk about, and he's a political scientist, so he has a very different perspective on these things than I do, and he said, he kind of shook his head and said, you're focusing on all the wrong things. You're focusing on individual level risk factors, so you're focusing on, decisions that women are making or what's going on in a relationship, and he said, what you should be focusing on is, kind of these bigger issues. For example, this rise in non-marital childbearing isn't just happening in the U.S. It's also been happening in Finland and Norway and Iceland and Sweden and very much in that kind of egalitarian, single woman, I can have children kind of thing. But it's not a problem there. It's not a social problem there because they have less unemployment and higher incomes and health care and child care. And so it hasn't been a social problem for them the way it's been a social problem for us. So I don't know if that, kind of speaks to that at all.
It's probably one that I'll ask of Pastor Foster as well, but the other thing that really leaps out to me is the increased incident among the African American community. And so would you respond a little bit, share some insight as to what you think is going on there?
Well, it's interesting. In the 60s, there was that Moynihan report that kind of sparked this conversation, several decades ago about non-marital births in African American families. That percentage has always been higher, at least in the times that we've been looking at statistics on this. It's always been higher. It hasn't been as high as it is today, that it's been growing. The difference has been growing. The difference between blacks and whites on this has been growing. It is, it's kind of all those things that we talked about. It is in part because of economic issues. It's in part because of cultural issues. It's in part because in terms of that marriageable man idea, the difference in the number of, kind of women of marrying age and men of marrying age, the biggest gap is in African Americans, that there are, demographically, there are more women than men. So there, there's all kinds of things, and I don't feel like I'm probably the best one to answer what's going on in the African American community. But I just know from a research perspective, those are all things that that are going on here. Yeah, Patty.
Sarah, so you say that most kids growing up in single-parent homes will be okay, but a significant minority will not. And I've never heard anything about what that minority is. What's the percentage of kids growing up in single-family homes that will not do well?
Well, there's not one percentage because it depends on how you define not do well. If we want to look at school outcomes, you'll get one number. If we want to look at mental health outcomes, you'll get another. If you want to define it as people that rise out of poverty, that's another. If you want to define it as people that go on to have a healthy relationship when they're an adult, that's a different, So there is no one number for how many kids don't do well. It just depends on the outcome, and these things are kind of on a continuum as well. So some kids are really, really not going to do well, and some kids are going to do marginally okay.
But we know it's a minority, so we know that there's some kind of idea about how many. We know it's less than 50% if it's a minority.
Yes, it is less than 50%. If I had to estimate, based on the stuff that I've read, I'd say 35%. but that's, a
Right,
rough
that's a wild,
estimate.
rough guess, sure.
Yeah.
What does the connection to a extended family structure possibly play into this? For those maybe single parents that are still connected within the extended family, how does that factor into differences that might occur?
The more support, the better. Being connected to extended family helps in a lot of different ways. It helps often financially, because there's often transfers going back and forth of financial assistance. It often helps with childcare. It helps with kind of relationships and mentorship and things of that nature. And so the more extended family involvement, the better the outcomes. The better the outcomes, I should say, on emotional, behavioral, on those kind of measures. On the economic measures, it's not as helpful.
Yeah. And,
Because those members are often in poverty as well.
Yeah. And to follow up with that, sometimes to find a job that can maybe help them raise economically out of a situation, you'd have to maybe move to another town or someplace that removes you from the extended family. So is there any connection between is it better for them to go and get a better job somewhere, or is it better to stay connected to the extended family? Or
That's a good question. I would say, and this is just my opinion now at this point, but based on kind of what I know, I would say it's better to get the job. It's better to get the job. Poverty is the #1 predictor of bad outcomes, period. No matter how you slice and dice it, no matter what the situation, poverty is the #1 predictor of bad outcomes for children, or worse outcomes for children. So anything that gets you out of poverty is probably better.
What is the political scientist saying we should be focusing on instead of?
The political scientist was saying that we should be focusing on social programs, that the reason why this is not a problem in other countries is because there is a stronger safety net, and they do not have, in the countries where this is also rising, but they're not experiencing the social ills, it's because they have, he told me not to use the word welfare state, but it's because they're economically much better off.
But I read something interesting about the economic crisis in Europe recently, and their willingness to pay higher taxes. They were focusing on Italy. And it raised an interesting point. They said that the nature, the demographics of European countries are more homogeneous. So an Italian is willing to pay more taxes for social service programs because they know it's going to another Italian that looks like them. And that there's a resistance to paying higher taxes in this country because of racial, economic, social conditions that don't exist in Finland or Italy or France or any of these other European countries that tend to have very good demographics.
Can I just make a comment about that? Being from Canada, I think we have a really diverse community, and in Canada, I think the attitude is sort of in between that of Europe and the United States, that there's more focus on the common good, and people are willing to pay taxes no matter who it's going to. It's just that they've decided that having universal health care is important, even to the extent that some people may say it's not as good for people of high incomes because they do have some limitation to health care. Not significantly, but there's a trade-off. So I just wanted to put that in because Canada is a very diverse country.
Yeah, well, and it's true that in a lot of countries it is just it's a value that people have. So that's it's interesting. Yeah.
One of my key response to a thing today was going to be essentially I kind of felt like there's a question that precedes the question of marital births, and that would be kind of like, even beyond statistics, why are there so many non-marital births? And the marriage thing isn't necessarily we could probably get into generational discussion about the importance of marriage. As a 34-year-old single person who's been in a long-term relationship and is not married and has made that choice not to be married, but I think the bigger problem in our society, and it goes to the egalitarianism, individualism argument, I think what's missing in our society without a marriage license is loyalty. I think we lack loyalty and we lack decency as a people. And because I think you don't have to be married, and you can be partnered with a same-sex person, and you can be in all kinds of different looking relationships and raise wonderful kids. But I think what we're missing is a concept of loyalty, and maybe that goes to the individualism, egalitarianism struggle that we're having as a society. But people don't seem to care about people. They don't seem to actually want to have a healthy relationship, and that's okay. We're not having a drive to be holistic individuals, whether that be in a marriage or just in a covenanted personal decision relationship.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm wondering how Keith would respond to that.
Well, let's
Okay,
let's
okay.
hold on, because we do have time for that.
Okay.
Would like to just put a pause or a semicolon right now on Dr. Mustillo's presentation.
Yay.